share my screen. So I'm going to talk to you today about making meadows, and I'm Lyn Bensenyei from the University of Wolverhampton, where I'm senior lecturer, and I did a PhD in creating hay meadows within urban landscaping schemes and how they are and best ways of managing them within those schemes. So I have got some experience of making meadows within the urban setting and then trying to manage them as well, which can be problematic, but can also be achievable. So I've included my address there, my email address, if you have any questions specifically about meadows and not about the grant, then I'm happy to answer questions that are about the botanical aspects of that. Anything about the grants, then please address those to Ruth, because she can answer them for you. So I'd like to talk to you today about a variety of different aspects of these. So briefly about what creation is and what you can hope to achieve from various pieces of public open space or garden areas that may not be open to the public, but to open to a variety of different people within your community. So I wanted to talk to you about different kinds of meadows and how they're best created, and a little bit then about the soils and looking after them afterwards, so in terms of keeping them for perpetuity. So those are my contents. So in terms of introducing them, these are wildflower meadows, and I'll keep that term for the time being, are areas there that can be stunning, so they have a good aesthetic value for people within the community, but not only for people but also for biodiversity. So some pictures here of insects using meadows, such as painted lady on the left and the holly blue on the right. So ideally, when we say green spaces, we're looking to promote biodiversity within these planning for these grants as well. So it's not just about community involvement, but also putting something back for nature to increase these spaces for good biodiversity. So biodiversity, that includes all aspects of nature, so includes plants and animals, and specifically in this case, pollinators, which are insects that are looking for nectar from most of these flowers and then spreading pollen at the same time whilst they're doing it. So we're looking to retain as much diversity from these as we can once they've actually been created. Wildflower meadows is a bit of a grand term really that people use that could encompass two specifically types of meadows, which I'll come on to, which are quite different really in terms of how they look and how they're maintained, and also about how they're created. So they're often used by local authorities in landscaping schemes, or they're used by landscape gardeners in, again, landscaping schemes. So there was a big one of these at the London Olympics that looked particularly stunning, that had all manner of different flowers in it. And presumably it was good for pollinators as well, but it stretched extensively throughout the site for the Olympics. So wildflower meadows are usually grown from seed, and you can usually buy these from seed merchants. So they're very colourful and they have big aesthetic impact almost immediately on the eye. So the plants themselves grow quite quickly and can be in flower for most of the summer period. So they have a potential to have biodiversity within them. So you're not bringing that in with the seed, but you're attracting that from the local area. And these types of meadows are usually created differently from traditional methods, and they have slightly different management requirements. So these are pictorial meadows. Usually the term wildflower meadow refers to pictorial meadows. So this is a different one. This was actually sown in Coventry, and a colleague of mine took that and sent me the photograph. So as you can see, between the two, there are different mixtures of different colours, as you'd guess, from different species of plants as well. Quite often there's lots of poppies in them, and poppies can vary in colours and sizes. The stunning one in here in terms of the blue one is a blue knapweed. There are also some pink ones which are a bit unusual as well. So there are essentially plants that would originally have been agricultural weeds. So these would have been seen, let's say, in the interwar years or before that, all along the margins and within the wheat crop. So as wheat growing has become more mechanized, these weeds have died out, probably because of the use of herbicide. So they're quite rare in nature now, but people have harvested them and are now using them to look spectacular in landscaping schemes. So then the thing about them is that they're composed of annual seeds. So the plants here are not going to grow into the second year or again later on. But you might expect them to reappear in the second and or third year from seed that was probably dropped by the original crop of flowers that were in the seed already. So they usually have no grass component. So sometimes, depend on the seed merchant, they will put some grasses in there, but usually it's a collection of flower-rich species. So compare that with what we call a traditional hay meadow. So these are ones that you see more often perhaps in rural areas that are components of farms. And we have grown a lot of these in Wolverhampton. So we've got over 20 of these meadows in and around Wolverhampton, and the Birmingham and Black Country Wildlife Trust have extended these and are now scattered throughout their area. So there are a good number of these now in particular areas in their natural improvement area. So anybody doing any of these would add into that scheme that are already in place. So these are important meadows and have been important since Saxon times. So the most important field within the manor of a Saxon baron or lord would have been the hay meadow. So this is important to grow hay for the oxen that are ploughing fields, so to keep them alive during the winter period so that they can still continue to plough the land. It was important to have a good hay meadow, and those have been in perpetuity up until the end of the Second World War, when agriculture had a new dynamic, insofar as the government decided then that we were not going to be held to ransom by German U-boats any longer, and that we were going to be self-sufficient in our own food production. So many of these meadows have been dug up between now and the end of the Second World War. So with improvements with agriculture in terms of ploughing and in terms of fertilizing and in terms of drainage and herbicides, many of these meadows have been lost. So the figure 97% is quoted by lots of organisations, but that dates back to an article that was written way back in the 90s. So I would imagine that we've lost almost all of them by now. But however, happily, we now know how to recreate them, and people have been doing this in and around the country for the last 10 or more years. And in Wolverhampton, we've been doing this since the late 80s and early 90s. So these are actually a biological community. So phytosociologists have been studying these, and they're plant species that are used to growing with one another, and there are, you wouldn't see most of those pictorial meadow species within any one of these. So you're getting a completely different mix of flowers and grasses in here. So that's the main feature about this. You're getting the associated biodiversity here. So when we make these, we're using actual hay, ideally green hay that's been brought from a meadow itself, and the ground has been prepared beforehand. So you're getting lots of invertebrates when you get these meadows created as well. So they're brought in with the hay. In terms of creating either pictorial or traditional meadows, I think it's important to understand what you're taking on and to understand how they're created. So as I said, you can grow both from seed, or you can use green hay to make traditional ones. You'll be less successful at making pictorial ones by using green hay, but you still get lots and lots of flower species within species-rich meadows. So one of the things to consider when you're using seed is to consider how much that would cost. Compare that with whether or not you're able to bring in green hay from a source. So initially we were using a source that was 40 miles away on the edge of the Shropshire-Wales border in the Sniperstones region. And the Birmingham and the Black Country Wildlife Trust are using a meadow near Hales Owen, and other wildlife trusts are using local sources as well. So Plant Life have been using what they call their coronation meadows, which were designated per county way back when we celebrated the Queen's coronation jubilee. So we need to consider really where we are in the conurbation within the wider West Midlands, and whether or not it's feasible to bring in green hay, or whether it's more feasible to grow by seed, and what kind of meadow you want. So alongside that, you also need to consider the size of the creation. So where we're doing traditional management, we would traditional meadow creation, we would recommend the larger the better. And if you're in a more confined space and you want an immediate impact, then perhaps it's better to create pictorial meadows. Another issue is finances. That's always an issue for both types of meadow creation. Transport in terms of bringing in the hay is important. So you need to be bringing in a bale of hay at the minimum in terms of kind of working materials that you'll start off with. So that would also involve using people to strew the hay. And conversely, if you're making a pictorial meadow from a seed, then you'd probably need help with sowing the seed to make sure that local people felt involved with the project and had an ownership then of the results. And similarly, in terms of managing them, it's important to have the necessary equipment. So one of the main features that you need to understand really is the fact that the soil is very important. So the condition of the soil is important. So when I say the condition, what we really need is for the soil to be reasonably dry and well draining, but most importantly, that the nutrient levels are low. So for instance, in this particular photograph, this was an old sandstone quarry. So this is a kind of remnant soil that was in this area, which as you can see is very dry. But similarly, nutrient poor soils in any locality are good for creation. What we don't want is high levels of fertilizer that still remains in the soils. So it's not really possible to do this on old arable fields where lots and lots of fertilizer has been applied to the soils. Although it is possible to lower the nutrient levels, this usually involves cropping, so that you crop until you feel that there's a low level of nutrients remaining in the soils. So it's important to have low nitrate and phosphate levels in the soil, so you can have these tested. If you wish to go to the expense of having the soils tested, then that is possible by local organisations. A level of potassium is important because that's important chemical for flower growth and then for fruit development. So, but only small levels of potassium are required, not huge amounts of that. So that's really the main thing I want to say about soils. But obviously, depending on where you are and how much rain you receive, if you receive a normal amount of rain, as in most of the UK, then that's probably enough for your meadow, but if you're living in an area that doesn't get much rain, perhaps because it's sheltered from buildings, or you're in a rain shadow for whatever reason, then maybe you might have to think about watering those. And in large meadows, that can be problematic. So in terms of creating pictorial as opposed to traditional methods, or vice versa, you would need to create a fine tilth from the ground that you were going to create on. So historically, we have removed the existing vegetation by spraying herbicide on there. So historically, we have used Roundup and/or glyphosate, but glyphosate is now a banned chemical because it's carcinogenic, and I think Roundup might have a component of glyphosate in there. So you need to kill the vegetation and then rake it into a fine tilth after the vegetation had gone, take off the old vegetation, and then you need to bring in either the seeds or the species rich hay. And then this is kind of where they two diverge now, because you need, usually if you sow the seeds densely enough, then you shouldn't be allowing many weeds to come through. But it might be better if somebody was keeping an eye on them to take out any obvious weeds. If the weeds are floristic, then I guess that's not really a problem. However, in species rich green hay, if you're aiming to replicate the community that they belong to, then we don't want thistles and ragwort and class 3 weeds in there that farmers don't normally like. So we would recommend that those were removed either by strimming or again by spraying out, though I don't really recommend spraying. So traditional meadows take a while to establish, so may take up to about 3 years before you have a good show of flowers. Particularly can take longer depending on what kind of hay you've used and the kind of area that you've sown them on. So with pictorial meadows, once they've flowered, that's usually the end of your meadow. As I said, some of the seeds could drop back into the soil and you might be lucky to have a bit of a show the following year. Whereas once you've created your traditional method, it's important then to manage them ideally as they would have been historically. So that would mean, I'll come on to the management later. I've got a slide on the management. So in terms of creating pictorial ones, then you would need to go through the whole process in subsequent years if you wanted to retain that stunning effect. In terms of managing them, at the end of the season, so that's at the end of July, early August with traditional meadows, maybe with pictorial ones, you might get them to last into September. So once the flowers have started to die off, then you could leave them to die completely and then take them off in the autumn time. But in terms of traditional meadows, you would need to cut for hay. So that's completely cutting the whole of the vegetation and then turning it and drying it as you would have done in the old haymaking process, which usually takes about 2 weeks, depending on the weather. Most farmers seem to watch the weather forecast quite critically at that time of year and then decide when the best time is to cut for hay. And in many localities, they all share a cutting machine, and usually one person particularly goes around and does all the cutting. So then in terms of traditionally managing, these are usually baled and then removed off site. So it is very important to get rid of all of that vegetation. So it's not a good idea to leave the haymaking process until into September and definitely not into the autumn. So ideally these meadows are grazed in the autumn. So grazing is obviously problematic in the West Midlands, and it's also expensive in terms of fencing and in terms of providing water for livestock. So what we found is that it's usually possible to mow these, so to put them into a scheme, maybe with the local council, or if they are local council sites, then they can be mown fortnightly until that period of mowing finishes, maybe at the end of October, and then hopefully that would be enough. Or they can be mown by somebody in the community, maybe until the end of November. And then ideally they're left then until the following year, when they will start to grow and ultimately flower in spring and summer. Whereas conversely, these pictorial meadows will need restarting. So they would need weeding maybe to take out anything that's looking a bit too vigorous and might overshadow some of the smaller growing species. But generally speaking, most of these seed mixtures have combinations of plants that are all roughly the same size in terms of the height that they achieve. So you might manage to create your own seed bank and have a bit of a repeat show the following year, but it's going to be nowhere near as spectacular. So you would need to remove all the dead plants and then sow afresh each year in order to be able to perpetuate that kind of display. So when you're creating meadows, you probably need to consider what you're going to do. So what would be the purpose of the creation? So are you looking to perhaps turn over a part of a school field or an area of public open space, maybe create that into a meadow, and that's kind of then added to the wider natural improvement area of the Birmingham and Black Country Wildlife Trust? Or are you just aiming to improve the biodiversity of the area and adding into the nature value of that site? So that's, for me, that would be the main consideration, but clearly members of your community will have different requirements for what they want from a meadow. So usually it's quite nice to be able to walk through these. So I would recommend, if you do make one and you're wanting people to appreciate them in very large areas, it's useful to show that they're actually a feature of the site by perhaps trimming the edges and then mowing a path through them so that people can walk through and appreciate that they are there for a purpose. So obviously the cost is quite important in terms of initially creating these, and that's why we're kind of offering, or the government are offering, funding for any kind of improvements, and this is just one way that the grant could be spent. So the management is important, and also if you're managing them well, you're then perpetuating your legacy for the community. In terms of people involvement, then in terms of management, it's important to know that you have the right manpower and the right machinery to be able to access these meadows, to then be able to manage them accordingly so that they do come back on a yearly basis. So for the grant, it's important that you leave a legacy, so it's not just something that you create as a one-off. So ideally you're providing an area of green space that has high biodiversity that will then be in that locality for the forthcoming future, and ideally for perpetuity, so that they will then be there and adding nature back into the locality. So you're leaving a long-term legacy of biodiversity at your site. So you're also improving the aesthetics of the piece of land that you're hoping to do something with. You're involving the community, and hopefully you would be doing that for longer than the year or the start year. So a lot of your success really depends on your ability to manage these meadows and as I said, the availability of machinery. So whether that's as simple as a strimmer or a mower, however big that may be, or whether you need a tractor mounted flail on the back of the tractor to be able to cut them. So a lot depends really on your community involvement and whether or not you've got any conflict on whether or not you want to use this site as a meadow. And ideally you wouldn't want people to be despoiling these areas, so you want to keep them tidy and not have any rubbish in them. And if you want to sell the hay, then you wouldn't want to have any dog mess in them either. That was something you were thinking of doing, depending on the location. In terms of local legacies for comparison between the pictorial and the traditional meadows, so you're looking for an aesthetic really with the pictorial ones, and have an immediate impact in terms of their colour, whereas they will have a biodiversity value in terms of the insects that you'll attract to that site, and therefore you're doing a benefit to pollinators in the area, whereas the biodiversity in traditional meadows stretches to local plants and also to other invertebrates, as well as insects such as butterflies, bees and hoverflies. Birds might well nest in them as well, so things like skylark or curlews, ground nesting birds, that would be good, which is less likely in inner city areas. That really depends on your locality as to what kind of biodiversity you're including. So the pictorial meadows have a lower management requirement insofar as you sow them, you set them up initially, sow them, and then re-sow them the following year, whereas there's a bigger burden with the trying to perpetuate the traditional management in the traditional meadows. But both of these can involve the local community, or I guess you could employ somebody specifically to be able to do the required management for either of these types. So just to finish off with, really, I've put together a short list, and obviously there are more people doing this than the ones I've listed. But as I said, Plant Life, which is a plant charity that looks to preserve the biodiversity of the UK flora, have a website that includes how to make the meadows, and the next slide includes the links for all of these things that I'm suggesting. Bug Life again, so they're looking to help pollinators. So they've got some instructions on how to make meadows for bees, butterflies. Butterfly Conservation again have something similar. So they're looking specifically for you to help butterflies and moths. So I've included Natural England and DEFRA because both of these provide funding. So they provide funding, government money. Both of these are government organisations. So there are such things as countryside stewardships, and there's a new scheme coming in that kind of replaces the money that we would have got from the EU. I'm not sure on the details of all of those, but I do know that nature reserves within the wider West Midlands are using those schemes, particularly for meadows that have been created with within conjunction of the Birmingham and Black Country Wildlife Trust. So I've linked them in because, as I said, they've done a lot of creation work over the last 5 to 10 years and have had funding for that from various benevolent funds, essentially, and not from the government. To some extent from the National Lottery, they've also had money. Warwickshire Wildlife Trust have done less of this, so I'm including them from the point of view of Coventry. So but however, Warwickshire do have more natural meadows or traditional meadows within their remit, so they have got sources of hay. So both of those organisations have got personnel in there that know how to create meadows, so will provide help, I would have thought. Royal Horticultural Society have got some information on their pages, mainly about gardening, pictorial meadows and how to create them. And similarly, the Wildlife Trust, the National Trust have got information on there about a garden that they've created. So that's quite a nice link. There's quite a nice, stunning display from both RHS and National Trust in terms of creating a meadow, but a pictorial one. So these are the links there for those. So those should go straight to the pages. So the Birmingham and Black Country is actually a pamphlet that summarises the work they've done for their natural improvement area. So most of that really goes to say what kind of meadows they've created in what localities, how they're looking to make this a landscape approach, and also there's a bit in there about their woodlands and how they've managed those. So those are useful links, I would think. So that's my very short talk about creating meadows and managing them. So if anybody has any questions, then I'm happy to answer those, whatever they might be.
Thanks, Lyn. I'll stop recording.
Okay.